Our next panel is going to look at CSB's work with partners on the Return on Sustainability Investment, or ROSI, in the automotive industry. There's going to be time for audience Q&A after the session, so please hold your questions. To moderate our panel, I am thrilled to introduce Elyse Douglas, who's a senior research scholar here at CSB. Elyse has spent 30 years as a financial executive, including as chief financial officer at Hertz and a member of the board of directors of Assurant. At CSB, where we are so very lucky to have her, she creates monetization models for applying the ROSI methodology across industries. Welcome to Elyse and to your panel.
Thank you. All right. Well, good morning. I'm very excited to be moderating this panel on the return on sustainability investment in the automotive industry. The auto sector is at a critical crossroads right now. Sustainability is no longer a nice to have, it's a strategic necessity. So companies, you can see from these quotes by CEOs, that companies that are leading in sustainability are the ones that are driving innovation, improving efficiencies, mitigating risks, and enhancing shareholder value and brand value. And before we get into the panel discussion today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing here at the Center for Sustainable Business in developing an automotive framework to help companies across the automotive sector in building a strong financial business case for their investments. So our research has identified 10 different strategies within the automotive space, and you can see them here on this slide. And as Tansi mentioned this morning, for each of these strategies, we've identified practices and sub-practices and benefits associated with each of those practices. And just to give you a little snippet of what that might look like, this is 2 examples within the mitigating and adapting to climate change strategy, one around energy management and one around phasing out internal combustion engine vehicles. And you can see here we have 2 different sub-practices and we have the various benefits associated with it. And we're now in the process of, for each of the benefits identified, designing a monetization approach. So to give people a proposed monetization metric in order to quantify the financial benefits. And we're doing that with work that we've done in the past in the automotive space, along with work that we're doing with auto companies today. And just to give you a sampling of one, here's an example of a strategy around waste management that we did in some of our earlier work, where one company was able to identify $235 million of savings related to their waste management practices. And that was really due to the reduction in input costs, in water use and energy use, and the less disposal fees, along with revenues from sales to recyclers. We plan on completing this research this summer, so stay tuned. So now I'd like to introduce our panel today. We have a terrific panel of experts. We've got Garrison, who's Senior Director of Sustainability at Rivian, the electric vehicle company. We have Maureen Kline, who's VP of Public Affairs and Sustainability for Pirelli Tire. And we have Jon Nelson, who's a partner at PwC, who's focused on automotive business transformation and sustainability. So welcome. Just to keep in mind that we want to keep with the value creation theme and that we really want to explore how sustainability drives financial performance and strategic advantage. So I'm going to start by posing questions to one of my panelists here, but I want a dynamic discussion, so please feel free to hop in as you see fit. So my first question is for Maureen. And I want to start in the sustainable sourcing space. So obviously, as a tire company, rubber production is often associated with deforestation and human rights issues. So can you talk a little bit about how those issues are impacting the company and what actions you're taking and the financial benefits associated with those actions?
Sure. So thinking about this brings me back to a few years before COVID when I got a call from GM saying we're worried about deforestation from our products. And, as a B2B, we sell tires both B2C to end consumers and then also to car companies. We sell a lot of tires to Rivian. And so GM was trying to organize the tire suppliers to look at this problem. But I knew that also in Europe, where there was a lot of public outcry, rubber was the next palm oil at that point. And so in Europe, that actually led to, the public outcry about deforestation has led to regulation because the voters wanted that. And so now next year we'll have the CSRD, the EUDR, the deforestation regulation in Europe.
And that's really requiring you to be able to ensure that your supply chain is deforestation free.
Exactly. So for us, it was, both a risk and an opportunity, obviously. We did several things. We worked with stakeholders to create a roundtable, and we have a pilot project in Indonesia, actually with BMW and BirdLife. Looks like the coffee slide because because of the biodiversity element in that, and so on. So there's a lot going on in rubber and combating deforestation. But then we also worked with BMW to do the first chain of custody audit with FSC certification. And it did cost a lot of money. Today we have a whole chain of custody group for all of the chain of custody type auditing for everything. And but what that does, we've heard already this morning about partnering with suppliers, being on the ground, talking about financial benefits. So first of all, I would say selling FSC certified tires to original equipment customers that are interested in that adds value to the tires for a sustainable vehicle. But then you have risk avoidance, you have regulatory compliance, but then also you have business continuity management. Because, I remember some years ago, there was also a moment when the media started talking about, are we going to have a shortage of natural rubber? I forget for what reason. And we had, obviously, our rubber procurement team on the ground knowing the situation. But we also we were working at the time with an NGO that was actually on the ground training farmers in avoidance of sustainable insecticides and avoidance of disease that was hitting rubber crops and so on. So things like that give you, kind of hands-on, on the ground data and information about business continuity that is very important.
So clearly lots of benefits, whether it's better engagement with your suppliers. BMW, I'm sure, is a very loyal customer. You're building resiliency at the plantation level. I'm assuming that there's a premium price for FSC, whether you can pass that on or not. Maybe
that's right.
Debatable, but there's a premium price. So clearly lots of financial benefits associated with it. But I think the really important thing is here, you did this a while ago when it was not necessarily economic, but in light of the regulations today and the EU directive, I would assume you're ahead of the game in terms of that transparency and be able to comply.
Yes. FSC compliance is not exactly the same, but we're definitely ahead of the game in the traceability of the supply chain, knowing where we're getting the rubber from, which is really, probably 80% of the difficulty.
Yeah, that's great. So Grant, I'm going to stick with the same theme on sustainable sourcing. You've got similar issues in mining of metals, right? There's environmental and social issues there. Can you talk a little bit about, I know you're kind of early in your journey, Rivian being a relatively new company, but can you talk a little bit about how you're addressing that?
Definitely. So I would say, I'm relatively new to automotive, and it's a lot of acronyms and a lot of inside baseball that these folks probably know better than I do. But hopefully, I can explain a little bit of that as a learner. So one thing is there have not been a lot of new automotive companies until Tesla and Rivian and Lucid, sort of the EV era. It had probably been 100 years before there was a new automotive company. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's a very, very hard thing to do. And one reason is you have to create an entire supply chain from scratch. And so our vehicles are among the most complex items that are produced, certainly consumer items. There are thousands of parts in a Rivian, and each of those parts may also have their own supply chains as well. So it's an extraordinarily complex process. So we didn't have a supply chain until 2021. And so as what we have the luxury to do then, or the benefit to do, is to build our responsible sourcing strategy while we're also building that supply chain. And so the steps we've taken over the last couple of years include establishing a human rights policy to make sure we are clear about our expectations there. We have a supplier code of conduct that lays out our expectations, both environmental and social, for our suppliers. We have begun assessments and audits against that supplier code of conduct. We have a number of product goals that include those, as well as priority material assessments. We're just trying to understand the material landscape. So we're taking we're part of multi-stakeholder collaborations like IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, which has the, really kind of the gold standard mine site level standard for human rights and environmental protection. So we're, those are the steps that we're taking to build it, but it is an ongoing effort. As you may have read in the news, today is a particularly dynamic one for the auto industry. And so, as you're working with your supply chain partners who are also dealing, with a tremendous number of complexities and scenarios, we are fortunate that we can also work with them to make sure that we're building these foundational elements. Yep.
And you're also doing a lot with LCA analysis, right? And that kind of goes into your supply chain as well. You're incorporating all those aspects in your LCA analysis. And do you find that kind of helps you better prioritize where those risks are within the supply chain?
Definitely. I mean, I think so. Product lifecycle analysis is an extremely important tool. It is not a tool that all companies use or release publicly. We have released the lifecycle analysis of our products from the launch edition of our R1 consumer products and our RCV delivery van. And so that process is, we were talking about it earlier because Pirelli is part of that process. But, that looks at what's really, really important about that team is that it's embedded in the product development cycle. So an LCA that we publish is a rear-looking document. It tells you at the end of the 3-year cycle that new models go through, design and concepting and revision and production, you then have a finished product, and we can tell you the life cycle impact of that product. But even more valuable is to have the capability to do those analysis as you're considering design and engineering elements, because then you can give real-time feedback to the engineers to say, this choice, one of, as RJ, our CEO talks about, millions and millions of choices are reflected in every vehicle. As you're considering those choices, you can then understand as one input the life cycle analysis, the environmental, in particular, the impact of those.
I love that example because I really think it goes to show how you can embed sustainability, right? It becomes part of everything you do, the design of the vehicle, the manufacture. So anyway, that's great. Thank you. So Jon, you deal with lots of different clients in this space. How do you see them addressing other environmental or social issues, or even the same ones in maybe different ways?
Yeah, it's been interesting, and my perspective is maybe a little bit different from Grant's because a lot of the companies I've worked with, and then I spent most of my career has been with PwC. I had a 10-year sabbatical actually working at an OEM that was let's say a legacy traditional OEM. And so in our instances, it was not about developing a supply chain, but converting a supply chain, right? So you have a very established supply chain that developed over, 100 years that needed to evolve. And that's a lot of the challenge that a lot of the companies I work with today are dealing with. You have an entrenched supply chain. How do you deal with that? And how do you integrate changes into that? And, it really a lot of things started with going back to disclosures on conflict minerals 10 or more years ago. And that really started a process whereby we saw a lot of action in the industry where companies were codifying their views on ethics within their code of conduct policies. And then from that cascading down into the organization, into procurement, starting to ask questions of suppliers to better understand where are things coming from, and the human rights considerations and environmental considerations of content going into vehicles. And then honestly, one of the other things that really was illuminating was COVID and the supply chain disruptions that came in the wake of COVID, because it really highlighted some fragility that was existing within the supply chain. And so becomes a bit of a business imperative that is coupled with this opportunity to relook at and rethink about the impacts from an environmental standpoint, from a GHG standpoint, but also looking for things that are more durable, sustainable, resilient, less likely to disruption, less subject to disruption, so that business continuity is hopefully improved, along with the other benefits of achieving your CSRD and other commitments.
And that kind of coincides with what Jillian said this morning, where she thought COVID was going to be a deterrent, and actually people started to realize that business resiliency matters. Yep. So Maureen, the tire wear itself is an issue from a sustainability standpoint. Can you talk a little bit about that, some of the innovations and ways that Pirelli is addressing those issues? Maybe you want to explain them first.
Yeah, so when the tires are on the road, obviously they're wearing down, and that particulate matter is a big issue. It's a big concern for us. We have a global sort of scientific collaboration called the Tire Industry Project under the World Business Council for Sustainable Development that's been really trying to address this. But overall, I would say we're using more and more innovative materials to make stronger tires that wear less. The industry has developed abrasion testing so that we can measure it in a standardized way. The EU is thinking of adding tire abrasion levels to the label when you buy tires that's available in the EU. That's kind of like a refrigerator label with 5 stars for energy efficiency and so on. And so we're doing that kind of on the inside, and then we're also in a lot of stakeholder talks about mitigation, about capturing tire wear particles in stormwater galleries, about also types of asphalt. I mean, I've had to learn quite a bit about asphalt because, concrete with ridges that's supposed to be safer causes a lot more tire wear. But rubberized asphalt made with scrap tires is softer and causes less tire wear.
Yeah, I think that is a great example of circularity. Maybe you want to talk a little bit more about it. So the rubberized asphalt, where does it come from? It comes from black carbon, right?
Well, it's actually ground up tires, whole tires. I mean, they remove, certain things like the steel cord. But yeah, that is a great circular kind of win-win-win-win-win example. So you can, and largely because the costs have come down because there are new processes. So you can make roads that last longer and have less potholes and drain water more efficiently so they're safer to drive on in the rain, and all kinds of, and they're environmentally better, and they have a lower cost at life cycle. In other words, you have to repave less often.
So it sounds like a great opportunity for municipalities. And are you collaborating with any municipalities?
Yeah, well, we're on in my public affairs role, there's a lot of advocacy around that in the industry. We also have to make sure that we have all the environmental assessments across the board. For instance, just a few days ago, California finally came out with the results of a study on synthetic turf and found that it was not they did not find any issues to human health. That doesn't mean that we would promote it necessarily, but there's just you need to look at all of these things very holistically. But we've seen really promising results from rubberized asphalt, and if all the roads across America were paved with rubberized asphalt, we would not have a scrap tire problem.
That'd be tremendous.
But we also put scrap tire material into our new tires, which is a separate issue.
And so recycle, and also you've got this circular outlet with the rubberized asphalt. John, you wanted to make a comment?
I was just going to add a point, because one of the things that I found interesting as I was spending time in the product planning function of an OEM was that as there's a real interconnectivity between the OEM and the suppliers, and the need for collaboration is kind of obvious. But because as vehicles change and as EVs are adopted more, EVs like for like are heavier, and that can have a dramatic effect on things like tire particulate emission. But also interestingly can have a positive effect on things like brake particulate emissions, because there's less braking, is rather using regenerative power in the vehicle to recharge the batteries. So as vehicles change and as the mix of vehicles change, the impact both on emission and on the supply chain are also changing, right? So it's a rather dynamic environment.
Yeah, and I think both of you guys on our previous conversations mentioned some of the innovations like vacuums inside the tire wheel to pick up the particulate. So lots of innovation going on in this space. It's a challenging, it gets into that microplastics, which I think was mentioned earlier, in terms of getting into the water supply and what have you. So it's a topic that I'm sure is concerning consumers. It's concerning NGOs, and so there's reputation risk for companies in terms around this space. So clearly, a lot, I think, of innovation is going to continue. I want to talk about decarbonization, but I want to leave EVs aside for a minute. So I just want to ask about, what other strategies other than EVs are you engaged in to address, to decarbonize the business? So let me start with Grant.
Sure. So the transition to EVs is critical for climate change, but it's not as though EVs are magical vehicles that don't require any carbon. There's carbon in the production process, and there's also until we get to 100% green grid. There's also a lot of carbon that's used in the charging in the vehicle use phase, although it's significantly less than an ICE vehicle. So we have, before, like I was talking about how young we are. So actually, back in November 2020, before we had sold any vehicles or produced any vehicles, our CEO committed to the climate pledge and to being net zero by 2040. So that's sort of our longest term commitment. And then we came out with a set of impact goals that also include 100% renewable energy in our operations by 2030, as well, both production and non-production facilities. And then we also have a charging network. It is a growing charging network called the Rivian Adventure Network, and that has always been and will continue to be powered by 100% renewable energy. And so we're growing that as fast as we can. We also introduced in December that the first 10,000 miles of all new Rivians will be matched by renewable energy that we sort of procure on behalf of the customer, and that is not a paid addition. That's sort of just part of the purchase price. So we're trying to take a number of steps to do our part in greening the grid, somewhat in partnership with and on behalf of our customers, because it's hard to do it as an individual if you've ever tried to call your utility and make that happen. And then the last bit is where we committed to a vehicle with half the lifetime carbon emissions as our launch vehicle by 2030, and we're well on the way to achieving that.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah. And obviously, a lot of this messaging goes to your brand equity and your brand image, right? It's really part of.
Yeah, I mean, Rivian is really inextricably built on a brand that has to do with really getting outside, living an active lifestyle, and taking care of the places that we like to explore.
Maureen or John, anything else to add on decarbonization strategies?
I'll just say Rivian wouldn't buy our tires if we didn't also decarbonize. so,
There's your benefit.
we're looking at decarbonizing operations through electrification first of all our factories, and then sourcing renewably. And I'll just add that in the automotive industry, there are some interesting. I've been on the phone with a group of OEMs that are putting together free ways for small suppliers to band together in power purchase agreements and things like that. We also have a group in Georgia called Drawdown Georgia of all the big companies in Georgia that are collaborating on, solar projects and so on. So I think these are, the way to decarbonize operations going until we have, that magical way to run a factory 24/7 with renewable energy.
Yeah, that's great, John.
And maybe just add a little bit, because I think one of the benefits that I've seen as well in terms of as you look for sustainable sources of energy to run plants is that there is maybe an unexpected ancillary benefit that came from that as well is again, resilience in supply, particularly if you have factories that are located in a place that's potentially being disrupted by tariff or trade disputes or other conflict. And so, those locations where they had established a supply arrangement that was sourced specifically with renewable energy was less disrupted than others where maybe you're dependent upon traditional sources of energy like natural gas. Yeah. And then the other thing is, and I can encourage everybody, when you leave today and go look at vehicles that are out on the road, look at new vehicles versus old vehicles. You'll see a lot of this kind of flowing through the product. You'll see things like newer vehicles often have less chrome being a very high energy kind of a material. And also on the inside of vehicles, a lot more recycled materials or natural materials, less use of plastics, less use of leather. Things that, in addition to supporting carbon, also support lower water usage and other things to help to make the product more sustainable.
Okay, that's great. So now let's get into the EV space. So I'm going to let Grant, why don't you talk a little bit about, since you are an EV-only company, talk a little bit about where we are in terms of the evolution of EVs and the adoption curve and how Rivian is looking at that.
Okay, and stop me if I go on. So it's very important to our business. So I would say, there's a very sort of strong narrative that EV growth is slowing, that EV demand is not as strong as expected, and I guess what we see is quite different from that. So globally, EV sales were 14% of all vehicles sold in 2024. In the U.S., EV sales in December were 10% higher than in the previous December, and this February was similar. So we are seeing continued growth. It may not be the sort of exponential growth at the very early part, but as any new technology has a adoption curve, that adoption curve is not either a hockey stick or linear. It tends to be sort of an S. And Bloomberg Green has done a study that if you reach 5% penetration, that's sort of the tipping point when the infrastructure starts to follow and you kind of get past those early adopters. And so that's where we are, I think, on the EV adoption curve, is that we're sort of past the early adopters and in a critical point where we now need to become mainstream. And what we talk about is the main way to do that is through making great products. There are just still not enough great EVs out there. If you want to buy an electric minivan, if you have kids and you like a minivan, you can't do it. And so, customers, all of us have gotten used to tremendous variety in everything that we buy, and we need to create that same variety for EVs. And we're starting to see it. There's more products coming out, but we're still not there where it's really parity with ICE vehicles. And so that's the primary thing. And and I think the other is to kind of normalize it. How many people in here? Well, we're in New York, which is one challenge, right? If you live in the city, it's harder to have. You may have seen we spun off a kind of multimodal EV electric company yesterday to kind of work. You see in New York a lot of scooters and other ways of transport, so it may not all be vehicles, but so we have to normalize the experience. I think as an EV owner, it's like you still get some folks who are like, wow, what's that like? And there's still some funny experiences, like you end up in a Walmart parking lot in a small town because that's where the charger happens to be. But I think we need to sort of switch our mindset from that to where we're going, which is an infrastructure that's designed for EVs, where when you pull into a charging stop, it's more like the one that we've created in Joshua Tree that's designed for EVs. And while you're charging for 20 minutes, you can also take a walk on the nature trail. There's hammocks, there's a playground for your kids, there's food you can buy. So we need to sort of get into that mentality of how do we design for it, as opposed to sort of jerry-rigging the old infrastructure to the new technology.
Right. And you also talked about, when we talked earlier, about having to convince the consumer the value of an EV. And there is when we look at our framework, we're going from the supplier to the OEM to the driver, right? Yeah. So how would you describe the EV driver economics? EV versus ICE.
So it is lower total cost of ownership. So we're getting there. Yeah, we're getting there on parity of purchase price, but the cost of ownership is low. How many people here drive an EV, just out of curiosity? So this, for a New York audience, that's pretty good. And so I guess I would say, I like that I don't have to go in for oil changes. There's no engine in there, right? It's a totally different propulsion system. So the cost of ownership over time is lower because both charging is less expensive than gas, and the maintenance tends to be lower. So that's a tough sell when your sticker price is higher. But as the sticker price comes down, that's one piece that will be significantly better. And then, as RJ, our CEO, also says too, when you buy your ICE vehicle, it's never going to get more or less efficient. It's always going to be exactly as efficient as it is when you purchase it. The great thing about an EV is that in 10 years, if we get to the place we all want to be, where there's more renewable energy on the grid, your car is becoming more renewable over time. Your car is becoming greener because the power that's charging it is becoming greener. So, and on top of that, I would say the driving experience is better. That's my personal opinion, and getting better by the day. And the big difference here is between, legacy OEMs who have real challenges in terms of changing their entire way of working with suppliers, and every, hundreds of computers connected to individual parts. The computer that does your window is different. The computer that does your HVAC is different and all provided by different suppliers. Whereas Tesla, Rivian, Lucid, because we own the hardware and the software, we are able to run and update that software every month. So it's much more like your iPhone, where you're getting updates, you're improving the product constantly. That's a completely different experience than driving even an EV built by an OEM, which I have done, where the technology doesn't change, the entirety of, or very basically changes over the lifetime of the vehicle. So I think as customers start to expect software-enabled vehicles, software first and sort of technology first, EVs are going to start to beat on performance, and then be as good on cost or better, and for all of us in the room, much more sustainable.
So that creates a real challenge for traditional auto companies. So Jon, maybe you can talk about the traditional companies. It's clearly an obstacle, a challenge. How are they addressing it?
Yeah, I think a lot of the points that Grant made are from my perspective, spot on, because I think one of the challenges is that it's tempting to fall into a trap of comparing EVs today to internal combustion engines today. But internal combustion engine vehicles are the cumulative benefit of 100 years worth of development, right? So you're on generation 10, generation 15. EVs are more or less on generation 1 or generation 2. So as that technology advances, as the capabilities increase, as the cost decreases, I think it'll be a real disruptor. And you can look at numerous examples throughout history where technology has innovated and ultimately has displaced existing tech as that cost has come down and as the performance is better. And I think every OEM is struggling with dynamic, and how to keep pace with some of the disruptors, whether it's a Tesla or a Rivian, or also from some of the Chinese OEMs like BYD, who have fundamentally changed vehicle development and design. And it's difficult for established companies to pivot like that. And that pivoting, one of the challenges is, in addition to the challenge on total cost of ownership and customer adoption, it's also regulatory uncertainty, environmental uncertainty around tariffs, and all these things which can distract from longer term strategy, because you may have to deploy capital to deal with nearer term challenges and headwinds and complexities, which perhaps slow your pace of development.
So what advice do you give your clients to be able to look at all those uncertainties and be in a position to allocate that capital appropriately?
Yeah, I think there's a few kind of golden rules that are really important. One is preserving optionality as much as you can. Don't paint yourself into a corner. So, you can make decisions about moving forward, but try to make decisions that allow you some flexibility to adapt in a very rapidly changing environment. 2, scenario plan and war game, right? I think the days of using a static kind of business case for assessing whether or not to develop a vehicle are gone, because you think about the development time of a vehicle, it's 3+ years typically, depending on what your starting point is. And then you're hoping to recapture all those capital investments, which were hundreds of millions of dollars to develop a vehicle and to industrialize a vehicle. You need to recapture that over 7, 8, 9 years of production. So you're looking at a 10 to 15 year time horizon from when you start your investment until ultimately when you sunset the production. Being able to predict with any sort of reliability what the end world looks like over that period of time is really difficult. So you need to be dynamic in your planning and your thinking.
And you need to do a ROSI analysis.
There you go. That's exactly right. And we are doing a ROSI analysis with you, Grant. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and so one of our goals is to have 70% recycled steel and aluminum in our vehicles by 2030. And so what we're working on with ROSI is to assess different scenarios of both carbon and financial impact of different percentages of aluminum, different sources, et cetera, to kind of provide our supply chain teams with that additional information as they're making sourcing decisions, which are themselves incredibly dynamic, especially today.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The other thing that we're doing a similar analysis with another company who's more exposed to some of the regulations in Europe, and the cross-border adjustment mechanism is something that's making it more challenging in terms of understanding where your supplier is located, what the implications are. Some of it's the direct tax that they'll see, and some of it's the indirect tax. What is the supplier? And it's going to get embedded in price. So there's so much uncertainty and so many variables that go into making business decisions in this space. We have 8 minutes, and I thought we might want to open up the conversation to the audience for some questions.
There we go.
Hi, I'm over here. My name's Samuel Money. I'm co-founder and co-CEO of a company called Purpose Hive. And hopefully the purpose part might trigger what I'm going to ask about. And as we're talking about the automotive industry, there's this minuscule thing of a 25% tariff that's just been slapped on the industry, which hasn't necessarily come up. But perhaps more for Grant, I'm thinking about the G in ESG, governance and ethics. And in this industry right now, there is a major brand with a CEO who's gone a bit right-wing, and there is protests and vandalism and boycotting of Tesla happening. I'm curious to know how the G, the governance and ethics in Rivian, because that's part of sustainability, what kind of role does that play within your organization? Because we've seen that aspect of sustainability is having a direct impact on the P&L or performance of a business or a brand. So obviously there's things you can or can't say. I'm just curious to know how the governance and ethics part might be a major conversation, because you can link that to sales decline in Germany and France and US, and we're seeing it now, and apparently you're a domestic terrorist if you protest a brand.
Yeah. So I would say, so first of all, I've spent my life in the world of purpose and sustainability. And the reason I'm at Rivian is because our CEO and founder, RJ Scaringe, is deeply and authentically in this work because of his belief that we have to move the world off of fossil fuels urgently to create, a future that our kids and their kids deserve. And so it is we are a purpose driven business. How that moves into governance to get into kind of the nuts and bolts is we have a board committee, the Planet and Policy Committee, which is chaired by Rose Marcario, former CEO of Patagonia and sort of luminary in this space. And so we have board governance directly over our sustainability program and work. We also have a steering committee, ESG steering committee that includes our CFO, our chief sustainability officer, Anisa Costa, my boss, as well as our chief operations officer and our chief legal officer, and that meets monthly to sort of surface and and manage topics as they arise, as well as the overall strategy. So we have, I would say we have deep, governance in place to ensure the continued, following of what RJ's put forward. But I will say it's not hard because really people come to work at Rivian for that same reason. And so reason it's so easy to embed it is because it's really a big part of why everyone, came to work there from other automotive companies in some cases or for wherever they came from. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're staying true to your mission. I think in the other example you gave, there maybe is a disconnect between the mission of the company and other activities. So I think we talked about it in the earlier conversation. I think Sophie mentioned it about, whatever you do from a sustainability perspective, it has to hold with your mission. Another question?
The mic should be on.
I should be on. So this is mainly for Jon and Grant both. But, the UAW last year, that strike, if I understand it properly from sort of just a retail mentality, was really about the EV transition from the ICE transition. It takes 4 mechanics to make one ICE, only one for EV. So you haven't put that into your 10 different boxes there of the value creation. Could you sort of understand why that wouldn't be a big part of it, which is employment and retention and those other factors that come out? Thank you.
I think, from what I've seen, and that's not unique just to the UAW in the US, I think a lot of legacy OEMs have a relatively high percentage of unionized workforce, right? Whether it's here in the US or in Europe or anywhere. And so this is a relatively consistent challenge. So a lot of the internal discussions end up being about retraining around, because as OEMs think about pivoting towards EVs, they are also looking at the valuations of companies like Rivian, like Tesla, like Lucid, and BYD, and thinking about how to emulate that. And a lot of that gets into owning a lot more of the value chain, both upstream and downstream, trying to integrate that within the business. And all of those create opportunities for employment in different ways. Not always blue collar, but there may be opportunities to upskill people and train them for other positions within the organization. And so I think that's part of the challenge to manage. I do think that it's probably a little bit, I don't want to say overblown, that's maybe too strong. It's because I don't think internal combustion engines are going to go away anytime in the very near future, right? It's going to take a while. I think the pace of EV adoption will continue to grow. There's going to be a demand in the marketplace that continues to exist for internal combustion applications because EVs aren't always the right application in every instance. And so there will continue to be those needs and those for that manufacturing base and for that skill set. And I think it's just a matter of any time you have disruption, and we faced it as an economy many times over our 200-year history and globally a lot longer than that, where technology and innovation disrupts employment in the short term. But it almost always creates opportunity on the backside. And it's navigating the change, which is the challenge.
And we do have it included in our 10 boxes. We have employee well-being is one of the key strategies.
One more question. Oktay Kurbanov, Climate Finance Partners. Batteries in electric vehicles are the most carbon-intensive parts, from what I know, and it takes multiple years for EV vehicle to break even with the ICE vehicle in terms of carbon intensity. So the question, Grant, what do you do to help the end-of-life recycling batteries, and do you plan to use recycling materials in battery production?
Great question. I will say we're a little fortunate in that none of our vehicles are even quite close to reaching the end of their natural life. So we have a little bit of time to think about that. And I don't mean that to be evasive. I mean, it's just true that we, the longest Rivian that's been on the road has been on the road 3 or 4 years. So we have some time to figure that out, and we're actively working on that. And so, because there's different applications of recycled batteries, end of life. You could reuse them. So you could consider applications like energy storage and use the battery sort of in its present condition to store energy, which is a big part of the sort of greening of the grid, is to have sufficient energy storage. You could also break it down into its parts. So companies like Redwood Materials are working on that. Sort of how do you shred the battery down back to the materials, because the materials are so valuable that they absolutely there's a recyclable marketplace for those materials. So we're looking at all of that and sort of thinking about pilots, et cetera, to consider what the right approach or mix of approaches are for us. But I won't say that we've figured that out just yet.
And I think that's consistent with what I've seen at other OEMs as well. Because if you think about it, EVs have really started to penetrate the market more in the past 5, 6, 7 years. And most are designed to be on the road for at least 10. And so it takes time for there to be enough volume of that recyclable material to really make the business case work. So where I see companies making investments today are on the early stages of starting to think about the logistics, the infrastructure, the model, and laying the groundwork for that. But until let's say the car park or the number of vehicles that are in the marketplace today that are starting to become obsolete and in need of recycling and taking off the road, until that is a larger percentage of the vehicles, the business case is immature. And so it is one of the longer term developments that I think OEMs will embrace because it's an opportunity. But it's down the road a little bit. So it's getting a smaller share of the capital allocation at the present moment.
And I just say that while I'm optimist about the transition, it's not inevitable, right? So there's a lot of work and a tremendous amount of capital that needs to go into building the infrastructure, because essentially we're moving from the horse and buggy to the automobile. We're now moving from the ICE engine to the electric vehicle. It's a similar transition. And so, there's, a tremendous amount that has to go into solving all of these problems at once, while we are not a fully profitable company, right? So it's sort of, we're trying to do a lot of things at once without perhaps the same level of government support that they have had in China, for example.
So I know we're out of time. So I just want to end on with a quote from Larry Fink, who said that companies that will lead in the next decade are those that see sustainability not as a constraint, but as the greatest source of innovation. We've been talking about today. And I want to thank my terrific panel for taking the time out today to be with us in light of all the activities that's going on in the marketplace today.